the villages and buy food for themselves. And Jesus said, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. You give them something. You. Well, they said to him, we have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish. And you know how the story goes from there. The crowd sits down on the grass. Jesus holds up the loaves and the fish, looks up to heaven, blesses it, breaks it, and gives it to his disciples to distribute to the crowd. And in the end, it was enough. It was more than enough. All shared what they had, all was well. Now, it's tempting for me to take the rest of my sermon time and talk about that feeding of those 5,000. Talk about the 12 baskets of leftovers. Talk about the satisfaction of all those full bellies, those hungry bellies that are now satisfied. The astonishment of the disciples who had never imagined such abundant result from so small of a beginning. Now, it's tempting to do so because it's been done so often. But it's important to me to remind you of the linkage between those 2 stories. Having received news of John the Baptist's violent death, his subsequent burial, Jesus withdrew from there in a boat to a lonely place apart. And then when Jesus' disciples describe this location, they say it's a lonely place and the day is over. Send the crowds away. A lonely place. Or a deserted place. Jesus sought a place apart. A place of solitude in which he could reflect, he could grieve, he could plan, he could pray. A lonely place can be a healing place when life seems to be making too many demands. But there's also a flip side to solitude. When you feel stuck in it, when you feel like it's a place apart from your real life, when it's a lonely place that you haven't sought in order to be on retreat or to reflect, but rather it's come upon you and it has swallowed you up and you're feeling lonely. Loneliness. Former Senator Charles Percy, in his book Growing Old in the Country of the Young, tells of a visit to a Chicago nursing home where he met an elderly woman who'd spent 27 years in nursing homes. And during all those years, she had received only 30 letters. And she had them wrapped up in what she called my precious bundle, and she kept it under her pillow. When people are isolated from their normal environments, they no longer see their friends and loved ones, they no longer contribute to society, they regress and die, says a North Carolina family physician. I've seen old people in reasonably healthy condition who, when put away in the isolation of custodial care facilities, lost total interest in life. They refused to communicate, refused to eat, become totally bedridden, wasted away, and died. This is a disease process called isolation, and it should be so designated on the death certificate. One man in a barren Chicago nursing home said to Senator Percy, "I do not belong to life." Depression is almost universal in older people, says one psychiatrist. Depression usually begins when elderly men and women, after years of independence, they find themselves ignored by a society that no longer has time for them. Withdrawal and loneliness are the inevitable results. Unquote. Growing old in the country of the young. So, as much as I am a strong supporter of having people take time out, take time away, be by yourself when you need to think or unwind or process your feelings or make decisions, take care that you don't go to the extreme of isolation, where you withdraw from others and you enter loneliness. You see, that is not what Jesus was doing. In order to process the news about John the Baptist's violent death and what that might mean for the movement they had begun, Jesus withdrew from there in a boat to a lonely place apart. However, when Jesus' disciples refer to that as a lonely place, there's something else going on. They're overlooking the fact that there are more than 5,000 people present. I mean, how lonely can a person be in a crowd as large as that? I mean, lonely? Well, back in 1950, David Riesman wrote a widely read book of social analysis called The Lonely Crowd. His subtitle is A Study of the Changing American Culture. And he said, most pre-modern societies produce tradition-directed character. They pay attention to the others and care for one another. Isn't that something I believe Hillary Clinton wrote a book called It Takes a Village to Raise a Child? Well, that's what he's talking about back in 1950. Tradition-directed characters are most easily noticed in the recent immigrants who come to America from peasant societies. The very ones that were trying to barricade our walls against, but they bring an other-directed kind of communal way of seeing things. And what they meet in American culture is usually a more inner-directed type of person who is characterized by biblical, pragmatic, utilitarian values of individualistic, independent citizens who are more attuned to their own personal sense of morality than to the cues of their neighbors. That's what we call the rugged individual, right? The entrepreneur, the self-made man. But David Riesman did not actually endorse this inner-directed, independent American, because he pointed out there's also very strong social pressure in post-war America that people should conform to certain social values. The people who prided themselves on being independent, inner-directed persons, in his opinion, were really responding to their social environment without knowing it. His book helped explain the rise of expressive individualists, such as the hippies, and the nonconformists, like Hare Krishnas, and the student protesters, and the hidden social prejudices that became so publicly apparent during the civil rights era. The self-made man, that independent, inner-directed person, actually lacked genuine autonomy because, as he points out in The Lonely Crowd, we are all interdependent. We are formed by interactions with other people, even when we don't want to admit it and we think it's all about us. It isn't. I thought of David Riesman's landmark study of the transformation of American character because of the disciples' statement in today's text. While they're surrounded by 5,000 people, they say, "This is a lonely place." Are there people who feel lonely in the midst of a crowd? The lonely crowd. Each person feeling separate from the others. Each person feeling like they are responsible, they have to look after their own needs without the traditional other-directedness of old-fashioned village life. Well, I encourage you to read this month's AARP magazine. Now, I know some of you are not old enough to get the Association of Retired People, but if you do get it, read about the loneliness epidemic. Loneliness, says Louise Hockley, a senior research scientist at the University of Chicago, loneliness is a universal human experience. And being the social animals that we are, there must be implications when our social connections are not satisfied. There's a human need to be embedded, to be connected, to be integrated in a social network, she notes. And when that social network is missing, the consequences are very real in terms of mental and physical health. The article points out that our people are becoming more socially disconnected in a variety of ways. But others point out that people who feel lonely, that intensely personal experience of being alone and being rejected or maybe disconnected or with some longing to belong, has really little to do with one's living arrangements or even the presence of other people around them in public. The feeling of loneliness can happen in a crowd. Researchers ask, well, what's the point of loneliness? What purpose could it possibly serve for our species? And the article points out that our earliest ancestors were sociable creatures, and they had to be. Those who were on their own were vulnerable to attack. They were easy pickings for hungry predators. So according to the evolutionary model, loneliness may have evolved as an early warning system, a signal in our body chemistry that something is not right, a feeling that prompts us to say, I've got to get back to the safety of my group. The stressful urgency of emotions being on high alert like that may work as a short-term response, but it can become deadly when it's ongoing. It's like having too much adrenaline in your system. We become anxious when we feel lonely. The stress of loneliness depression can impair our immune systems and actually inflame the breakdown. The human psychology interprets loneliness as a kind of threat. The human body is responding to millions of years of evolutionary conditioning that wants to be with other people. We want to belong. But the modern lonely brain, under the influence of that inflammatory response, the heightened level of stress, senses there's threat in its encounters with others. Threat, which is going to further isolate us. While the body wants to approach others to survive, the lonely brain has a short-term self-defense mode that sees in the coming person a foe rather than a friend. And when you put someone who is feeling lonely into a room alone, then they found out every person who comes into that room will be perceived as a threat. Every stranger is a threat to the lonely person. That unconscious sense of threat can lead to an endless behavioral cycle in which the lonely person sends out signals of disinterest, even hostility, which then causes the other to withdraw. And their loneliness is what's pushing them away. So maybe some anti-inflammatory like Aleve can break that negative feedback loop. So instead of interpreting every little comment as somehow something negative, maybe slowly over time people will feel a little less disconnected from those others around them, that the stranger might be a friend you have not yet met. Possibly. If we're not afraid